Hello everyone, sorry about 2 videos in a row, but this is one game we simply cannot miss. In the previous video you've seen how Alireza played with the white piece against Magnus Carlsen. He didn't fare well against his Berlin defense, but now he has the black piece against Fabiano Caruana, so definitely not a consolation prize one would hope for. But still, he had a great tournament so far, and then he faced Magnus. He didn't go all that great, but it wasn't that he did anything wrong. It's just that it wasn't enough. So let's see what he prepared for Fabi with the black pieces and how the game went. So without further ado, let's check it out. Fabiano Caruana, former World Chess Championship challenger, opens with d4. We have knight to f6, c4, g6, sorry about that. We have knight to c3 and now bishop to g7. The king's Indian defense is on the board. We have e4, now d6, the main line, and now h3. Fabi goes for a Makugonov variation, which will come in handy as he's planning on expanding a lot here, so this will prevent Alireza's pieces, mostly the knight, from reaching the g4 square. We have castles by Alireza, bishop to e3, and now knight to c6. We have d5, Fabi grabs more space in the center, knight to e5, and now f4. Now the g4 square is taken, so you are not retreating there. Knight back to d7, and now g4. So what do you play here? There is one game that reached this position, but it was between two much lower rated opponents, I think to 2000 and 2100, where e5 was played, but here Alireza goes for c6, and it is as of move 9 that we have a completely new game on our hands. So Fabi continues developing, knight f3, we have a trade in the center, c captures, and now b6, preparing to fianchetto the light square bishop. We have knight to d4 by Fabi, now with ideas of maybe going to c6 in the future, knight to c5, putting pressure on the e4 pawn, and now queen to f3, adding another defender to the e4 pawn. If you go knight to c6, doesn't really do all that much, just queen e8, you still have to worry about the e4 pawn, and it will only make it easier for black to play something like e6 to break open the center, since you will not be able to recapture or anything. So queen to f3 by Fabi, and the bishop to b7. And here Fabi went into a, well, not a deep thing, but a reasonable one, as Alireza pretty much didn't spend any time. Alireza had like an hour and 30 minutes on the clock, whereas Fabi had an hour and 13 minutes, and Fabi played g5. So what do you do here? What would you do here? Well, there's the option of going knight to h5. Knight here is possible, but then the two knights are just staring at each other, not really sure where the other one is going, and then just h4 is coming, h5, and so on. So your option is to go knight h5, which, yes, it prevents Fabi from further expanding on the king side with h4, h5, but then again you will just castle, and it's well, again, it's unclear where this knight is going. This knight is now coming to c6, king is coming to b1, e5 is coming, and all of White's moves are fair, very reasonable. But instead, even though this is playable, Alireza goes for knight captures on e4. He gives up a piece for a couple of pawns. So let's see how the game went. Knight captures on e4. You have to capture. If you don't capture, then you just lost a crucial pawn in your pawn chain. So knight captures on e4, and the bishop captures on d5. Now pinning the knight. And well, of course, hoping to win back the piece. So here Fabi finds knight to f6 with check. Now he will just give a piece back temporarily, but then capture the bishop here. E captures on f6, we have queen captures on d5, and now rook to e8, attacking Fabi's bishop on e3. So now, although you could maybe guard it with the king, not something you want to do, you allow knight e4 check, and also you will not be able to castle. So you're basically either looking at queen back to f3 or knight to c2. For this occasion, Fabi decides for knight to c2. Now the bishop is guarded, and here f captures on g5. Alireza opens up the bishop's diagonal, and Fabi says, okay, I'm out of here. There is no point leaving the king in the center any longer. We have queenside castle. Which again opens up an attack against Alireza's d6 pawn. But okay, Alireza continues grabbing material, G captures on f4, and now you cannot capture here. If you capture back, then queen f6 comes with an attack here and also here, so it's just game over for Fabi. So after G captures on f4, bishop to d4. It's a very important attacker, so Fabi definitely wants to eliminate it. It's a very important attacker and a defender. So bishop captures on d4, queen captures, and now the situation on the clock is pretty much equalized. Both players are now 1 hour on the clock. And now knight to e6, defending the f4 pawn and inviting Fabi to grab this pawn. And now you could capture it and go into something like queen f6, which guards the f pawn, prepares to push it. Let's say bishop b5 attacks the rook, rook a d8 pushes the queen back, queen a3, and now if you don't want to play something like rook f8, which would be silly, you have to react to this attack somehow. Probably captures, and now you move the rook, and now you have this position. Fabi still up a piece, but Alireza up 4 pawns, and he will start pushing his f pawn. So Fabi doesn't like this idea of queen captures on d6, so he goes back, queen to d2. Puts pressure on the f4 pawn, and Alireza goes queen to f6, adds another defender here, connects rooks, and now is ready to bring the other rook into the game. King to b1, and now rook 8 to c8 by Alireza, and now comes bishop to b5. Fabi develops the bishop. We have rook e to d8, and now knight to b4. The point is, Fabi wants to bring this knight over to d3. From d3, the knight will be used as a blockade against the d6 pawn, against the d pawn when it starts marching down the board, and also it will put pressure on the f4 pawn. So here we have d5, forcing either asking Fabi to take on d5 or saying I'm just going to continue pushing it. So what do you think? Can you capture the d5 pawn? Feel free to pause the video and figure out whether it's okay to grab this pawn. So for those of you that decided to grab the pawn, you just lost the game terribly. And for those of you who decided against it, congratulations. For you found knight captures on d5 and the queen f5 check. King to a1, now you capture the knight, rook captures, queen captures, and then rook to c1 check. This wins the game on the spot, because now after rook captures, the queen is no longer defended, just queen captures here, and the white lost the queen. So of course, Fabi did not capture the pawn. Fabi went rook h to f1. He puts more pressure on the pawn here, as the knight is coming to d3. He wants to eliminate this pawn. And now comes rook to c5 by Alireza. If queen to f5 now, it is possible to go after the h3 pawn, but for example, king to a1, queen captures on h3. Now white has this very nice knight to c6 move, which attacks the knight, threatens knight e7. The rook threatens knight e7 to pick up the other rook, and well, it's just maybe too much to give white. If knight e7, knight to d4 now attacks the rook again. Rook to e7, and now you can capture here. After queen captures, you pick up the f4 pawn, and it's well, basically you haven't won a pawn, you just gave up your very strong passed f4 pawn. So instead, Alireza brings another defender to the c5 pawn, and now a4. Also, the bishop is under attack, so Fabi defends it, and here d4. Alireza continues pushing his passed pawn. Now he has a passed pawn on d4 and on f4. Knight to d3, Fabi establishes a blockade against the d4 pawn, and also is now ready to capture on f4. So Alireza now brings yet another defender to the f4 pawn, and here both players are now on 30 minutes on the clock, so both of them taking care of their time. We have rook to f3 by Fabi, now adding a defender to the h3 pawn, but also maybe looking at bringing the rook to f1 and again going after the f4 pawn. So here Alireza g5, he says, okay, this pawn is now nicely protected, there's no grabbing that pawn, and here Fabi plays rook to g1, puts the rook in front of the king. So what do you play here? It's a very important moment in the game. Feel free to pause the video and find a move for Alireza while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on finding such a nice kingside expanding move. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, best here for black is h5, which prevents Fabi from ever executing this h4 idea, as you will just have this setup, and now it's probably black who's winning. But instead, after rook to g1, Alireza immediately played king to f8, and now he allowed Fabi this h4 breakthrough, which is huge for Fabi, as he's fighting against all of these pawns, and this just allowing him to open up files for his rook is could be too much. So here, of course, you cannot push because the you do not have a pawn on h5 to help you cover g4 square. So h6 by Alireza. Now h captures, and now rook to h3. So yes, rook to h3. So yes, Alireza does have two connected pass pawns, and he does have a pass d pawn, but he might have some problems defending. So here we have f3. It's possible as the g5 pawn is nicely guarded. It's attacked twice, but it's also guarded twice by the knight and the queen. And here bishop to c4. Now Fabi wants to eliminate one of the defenders of the g5 pawn. And here king to e7 is played by Alireza. There is no way to add more protection to the pawn. Since let's say if you try this rook f1, you're just going to lose this pawn. There's no way to add another defender to this one. So like I said, even though it's two connected pawns here, a pass d pawn, it's easy to pick them off. So that's what Fabi's plan is. King to e7 by Alireza. It will be the king is safer there for the moment, but bishop captures on e6. And now how do you capture back? Problem with capturing with the pawn and sort of creating a very strong center here is white can immediately punish you. Rook to h7 check, king f8, and now queen to h2. So what do you play here? For example, if f2, you just you can just even capture it, and if rook captures, now you have this rook to h8 check, king to e7, and now queen to c7 check. Rook d7 blocks, rook to h7. Adds another attacker to the rook, and now after king f8 you will just capture here, and there's no defense against mate. Even if you trade here, captures, king goes here, there's no queen c4 check to go for some sort of a perpetual because the queen covers it, and the next is just mate. So capturing with the f pawn is not possible, even though it would be great if you could get this pawn going down the board. So king captures on e6 by Alireza, and now queen to h2. Which creates a lot of threats here. Well, first one, of course, rook to h6, just winning the queen. So if you try running away, let's say king d7, then again rook h6. If the queen moves away from the control of the d6 square and the queen lands on d6, that's just over. So let's say queen e7, but now rook to c1, again threatening queen here, or rook here, just picking up the queen. Rook to c8, and now rook to e1, and this is just game, as now you cannot use any of these squares to keep an eye on the d6 square, and if you move to f8 to still do it, then just queen to h3 wins the rook. There's no way to defend it as it's pinned. So after this queen to h2 move and this threat, Alireza tries f2, now hoping that, okay, if rook to h6, I always have this very nice capture, but Fabi just plays rook to f1. That's why I showed the other line, as there was no way to avoid this. You have to give up the f2 pawn. So king d7 now, and now again rook h6. Fabi goes after this line, queen to e7, and now rook captures on f2. There's no reason not to capture this pawn. Rook captures on f2, queen captures on f2, and now it's move 39. Alireza needs to make one more move to reach time control. He goes king to c8, hoping to escape with the king, and now he does have a rook behind the passed pawn, but still it's unlikely that you will be able to get rid of this blockade. So Fabi goes a5. He wants to bust open the position, capture here. The rook is also covering that b6 square. B captures on a5 by Alireza, and now queen to c2 with check. King to b8, and now comes knight to c5 with all sorts of nasty ideas. For example, let's say you try f6 to keep the rook out of the game, then rook h7. The queen guards h7. You can now bring the rook to b7, and that's just a game. If you try g4, let's say you just push a pawn, then you're running into a forced checkmate with queen to h2 check. King to a8, now queen to h1 or g2 check. You force the king back, and then now this knight to a6 check. Only move king to c8, and then now queen to c6 check. Forces a block with the queen, and now this is mate. So after knight to c5, really not a lot of moves. This queen to h2 move check will be deadly. So Alireza blocks with the rook, kind of hoping that Fabi still goes for this queen to h2 pinning move, and he hopes to survive maybe with king to c7, but it also loses on the spot. So it's a nice idea, so even feel free to pause the video and try to find how it loses on the spot while I give you a couple of seconds. For those of you who were able to do it, this is one of the cases where the strongest move is not with the knight back, but actually with the knight forward. So here it's knight to b7. Congratulations to everyone who found that. Well, you just added a third attacker to the rook, and there are no moves here for black. You have to capture the knight and allow this captures, and now you're just up a rook. So this is one way to go about it, but Fabi obviously trusted Alireza on this one, and he decided to go for a different line. He played rook h8 check. We have rook to d8 blocking, and now queen to b3 with check. We have king to c7, and now comes queen to b7 check. We have king to d6, and now, of course, rook to h6 check. Here, Alireza blocks, but now knight to e4 with check. And it was in this position on move 48 that Alireza Firouzja resigned the game, and Fabi takes another victory. So here you resign as, well, if you move the king away from the defense of the queen, you just lose the queen, so your only other option is king to e6, which just runs into first knight captures on g5 with check, the pawn is pinned, you go back, now check again, you go back, and now just rook captures here. You know, first grabbing the g5 pawn for good measure, and now you force a trade. So captures, and and well, not with the knight. You don't even win the knight. Queen c6 check forces the king back, and now you pick up the queen this way, so it's much cleaner. And yes, you do have a rook behind the passed pawn, but that's besides the point. So yeah, after knight to e4 check, another excellent game by Firouzja against world number 2, Fabiano Caruana, also former World Chess Championship challenger, and it really, the quote above the board, I believe, is fitting, because here it was just, here at this moment where Fabi played rook to g1, if h5 landed, which really does make sense. It's hard to continue with white. Really, just finding a move for white is not easy, and even if, I mean, you can maybe even bring the king here, bring the rook over there. Maybe you can even start pushing here, but it's not what you want to do. But it might be an option in the future if white wants to push this for more than it is. But yeah, he played the king to f8 instead. It just got out of the pin, but then h4 just bust open the position, and now the extra piece really comes in handy. But yeah, really impressive game by both of them. But that's well, if you play against Fabiano Caruana, you do not give him anything, especially something like king to f8 in this position, because he will punish that. So yeah, that's the game. I do hope you enjoyed it, and here I prepared the standings as I didn't show them in the previous round. These are not the correct standings, as Vladislav Artemiev still didn't finish his game against Jeffrey Xiong, but I believe Xiong had a decent position. But okay, for the top of the standings, this is why I'm showing it. So Fabiano is now in the So lead with 7 out of 10, followed by Magnus Carlsen, then Wesley So with 6, Jordan Van Forest with 6 out of 10, and then I don't know if the others are correct, since Artemiev is on 4.5 and he might win against Xiong, so the table, you know, the score sheet might shift. But yeah, for the top, Fabiano Caruana after 10 rounds, sole leader of the Tata Steel Masters Edition 2020. So once again, I do hope you enjoyed it. I would like to thank Lenz Selestad, Philip Schweitzer, Asaf Pater, Lenz Gibbons, and John Bettinger for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the Tata Steel Masters Edition, checking up on the Women's World Chess Championship match. There's only 1 more game left, and of course, checking up on your wonderful suggestions. So thank you all, I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.